In our last episode, we talked about the first part of our cumulative case for Christian pacifism. What we call a redemptive hermeneutic, this idea that there is a trend towards redemption in the Bible. Yes, there was a lot of violence and there was a lot of eye for eye kinds of justice, but God was leading them to something much, much better, and we see that in the person of Jesus Christ and the commands that he gives us in the Bible. Next piece of this case is going to be looking at the early church. Hey, why do I care what a bunch of old dead guys think? That's a great question. First, we care because these old dead guys are early and close to Christ. There's a better chance that the disciple of a disciple who actually sat with Christ understood the teachings of Christ better than I do trying to read into it today. Second, we care about these teachings because they tend to be univocal. You don't find support from anybody in the early church for violence in the first 3 centuries or so after the start of Christianity. That doesn't just include violence for self-defense, but also things like abortion and capital punishment by the hands of the state, as well as soldiers. Naysayers, yes, we'll talk more about soldiers later. Finally, the teachings on violence that we see in the early church represent a preservation of teaching as opposed to a synthesis or development of teaching. What do I mean by that? We do know that doctrines develop. Take the Trinity. But the Trinity is an unpacking or development of a doctrine. It flows forth from who is Jesus and who is God. The final conclusion of the doctrine of the Trinity didn't deny any of the things previously taught. It just expounded on them. Something like just war and violence, however, aren't expounding on something that the early church taught. It's a contradiction of. It's not an unpacking of. It's a loss of what was once preserved. So, the early church, what did they think? Well, they had 2 main views against violence. One reason they were against it is because life is not ours to take. Leave vengeance to God. The other reason is because the only justification you'd have for doing violence would be to do the bidding of a king, and as Christians, we only have one Lord and King, and it is not Caesar. Diversity of sources in the early church that you can look to. The first group I would classify as ecumenical sources. Canon 12 of the Council of Nicaea, the Apostolic Tradition, the Testament of our Lord, the Didache, and the Canons of Hippolytus are all great sources to show you nonviolence as ecumenical in the early church. So lots of famous early church fathers where you can find nonviolence like Origen, Lactantius, Tertullian, Irenaeus, Clement, Athanasius, Cyprian, and Justin Martyr. Of course, we also see soldiers leaving the army and enemy attestation.